A girl who could draw your soul instead of your face, left behind sketches that still breathe when touched. More than a century later, her portraits are drawing themselves again, and the faces inside no longer belong to the dead. The house stood at the end of a forgotten dirt road, half hidden by the cypress trees that had reclaimed the fields. Its windows were blind with dust, the shutters hanging by one hinge, tapping faintly in the wind like loose teeth. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and paper, an odor that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, breathing from the walls. The historian moved carefully through the parlor, his flashlight trembling as it caught the outline of a collapsed portrait frame, a piano warped into silence, and a faint ring on the wallpaper where once a mirror had hung. His name was Dr. Alistair Main, an academic whose specialty was less in war history than in the strange intersections between memory and art. What brought him here was a rumor, a ledger entry in an 1,860 auction record that spoke of drawings that watch the watcher. On the parlor table, amid a scatter of decayed lace and rusted cutlery, lay the sketchbook. The cover was warped with moisture, the leather gray and crumbling, but the clasp still held. When he opened it, the hinge released a sound more like a sigh than a creak. The first page was blank, except for a faint watermark. Asterisk, asterisk, CH. 1864. Asterisk, asterisk. The next revealed a portrait graphite, finely shaded, a young man in a soldier's jacket, his eyes fixed slightly off-center, as though gazing at something behind the viewer. Beneath the portrait, in faded brown ink, was a single name. Asterisk, asterisk, Eli Thorne. Asterisk, asterisk. Dr. Main ran a gloved finger lightly along the paper's surface and felt a texture that unsettled him. It wasn't smooth, it had a faint grain, like skin stretched too thin. Each subsequent page bore another face, men, women, even a child, each rendered with unnerving precision. The eyes were never fully aligned, the mouths slightly parted, as if caught between a word and a breath. Their names were written in the same delicate hand: asterisk, asterisk, M. Havelock, S. Carter. Ruth Wayne. Asterisk, asterisk. Beneath one page, a faint indentation pressed outward, as though something beneath had once struggled to emerge. He angled the flashlight closer. The light struck a subtle bulge near the cheek of the drawn figure, distorting the graphite's sheen into a dull pulse. For a moment, he thought he saw it shift. He turned the page quickly and exhaled. The next drawing was incomplete, a girl at an easel, her hair falling over her face, one hand poised mid-sketch. The features were unfinished, but the outline of her mouth had been rendered in extraordinary detail. Soft, parted, expectant. Beneath it, the name asterisk, asterisk, Clara Havelock, asterisk, asterisk. There was no date. From the corner of the parlor came a faint rustling, paper brushing against paper, though the air was still. Dr. Main froze, listening. The sound ceased as suddenly as it had begun. He looked down again, and in the beam of the flashlight, he saw a new mark across the page, a faint gray smear tracing the arc of a hand, as though the pencil had just been lifted. The tape begins with the crackle of static, the kind that comes from decades of dust and forgotten reels. A man's voice introduces the recording flat, academic, the sort used in old oral histories. Asterisk. Interview conducted, May 12, 1957. Subject, Mrs. Ada Raines, age 89. Topic, the Havelock family, Aiken County. Asterisk then, the soft click of a reel shifting. What follows is the voice of the last person to remember Clara Havelock alive. Ada's tone wavers, caught between memory and performance, but beneath the quiver there is a peculiar steadiness, the kind that belongs to someone telling the truth of something they wish they hadn't seen. We called her the girl with the charcoal fingers, she says. She'd sit on the porch with that little sketchbook and rub her thumb black as ash. You could tell who she'd been drawing by the way they started looking. thinner, fainter, like she was taking something off of them and putting it down on that paper. The interviewer asks what she means by that, but Ada does not answer directly. The silence that follows lasts nearly 20 seconds, long enough to hear the faint creak of her chair and the rhythmic tapping of a cane against the floor. Then she continues, quieter. Her mama said Clara was born quiet. Not dumb, not slow quiet. The doctor said her tongue worked fine, but the words just wouldn't come. When she wanted to say something, she'd draw it instead. First the animals, then the folks in the house, then the ones who weren't supposed to be there. The interviewer presses her to explain, and Ada gives a soft, almost apologetic laugh. You see, she'd draw people that hadn't come yet, visitors, strangers, sometimes soldiers. She'd finish a picture, and within a day or two, they'd show up at the door every time. My aunt said it was a gift. My uncle said it was a curse. The tape crackles again, and the sound warps, as though the reel had been touched by a magnet. Ada's voice bends through the distortion. There was one man, a Union deserter, they said came to the house asking for food. Clara drew him before he even stepped onto the porch. I saw the picture myself. Same coat, same torn sleeve. By nightfall, he was gone. Only his boots left by the well. The last portion of the tape is barely audible. The microphone picks up Ada's breathing, slow and shallow, followed by the faint scrape of something being dragged across wood. Then her voice returns, no longer trembling but certain. She could draw what wasn't yet real, but every time she did, the world made room for it and took something back. The reel runs on for a full minute after she finishes speaking. No one moves to stop it. Somewhere deep in the static, there's the faint rasp of pencil against paper, steady and patient, until the tape finally runs out. The Havelock house sat low against the horizon, its roofline sagging under the weight of smoke-stained shingles and creeping vines. By the spring of 1864, it was less a home than a husk, half-burned by cavalry fire, the once white columns blackened and split. The war had retreated south, but its echo lingered here in the smell of ash and boiled linen. The surrounding fields had gone to weeds, the fences half swallowed by kudzu. Only the parlor remained intact, kept alive by Mrs. Havelock's impossible sense of order. She scrubbed the same floorboards every morning, even when there was no more soap, and laid out sheets for the soldiers who came limping through the pines, too broken or ashamed to return to their regiments. Clara spent her days in the light from the west window, where the glass had cracked in a starburst pattern that threw strange reflections across her paper. She didn't speak to the men her mother nursed, she never had to. They came to her out of boredom at first, curious about the pale girl who never smiled, who carried her sketchbook like a weapon. They'd sit on the porch, their uniforms in tatters, faces gaunt from fever, and she would draw. The strokes were fast, sure, almost impatient, as though she were tracing something already there. When she finished, she would tear the page loose and hand it to her mother without looking up. The men never asked for their likeness. None of them stayed long enough to collect it. Mrs. Havelock hung the sketches in the hall as proof that kindness had been offered, that the house still had purpose. But as the weeks passed, she began to notice patterns that unsettled her. The men who sat for Clara, the ones whose faces now stared faintly from the parlor wall, never made it to the next town. Neighbors whispered about deserters who had vanished between creek and road, horses found wandering, reins dragging in the dust. The rumor spread that the Havelock farm was cursed, that the swamp behind the house swallowed soldiers whole. At night, Clara would sit awake, the sketchbook open on her knees. The drawings seemed to darken after sundown, the eyes of each subject sinking deeper into shadow. Sometimes, her mother would wake to the sound of faint scratching, a pencil working long past midnight. She'd find Clara in the parlor, staring at a half-finished face that wasn't any soldier's she knew. When she tried to take the sketchbook away, Clara would press it to her chest, her charcoal-stained hands trembling. By the war's end, the house had become a waypoint for those who wanted to forget, But no one stayed long, not once they saw the drawings. The faces were too alive, too alert, as though they were still waiting to finish their sentences. The last man to sit for her, a boy no older than 18 with a scar along his jaw, told Mrs. Havelock that when Clara's pencil touched his cheek, he felt something move under his skin, as if a thread had been drawn out of him. He left before dawn. His horse was found 2 days later, the saddle empty, the reins wet with dew. Clara kept drawing. Each new portrait went into the same cracked ledger her father once used for crop records. When the pages ran out, she drew on the backs of old letters, then on scraps of wallpaper. By the end of that summer, the house was full of faces. None of them ever aged. The paper room was found by accident during the first attempt to stabilize the Havelock ruins. Workmen had been clearing fallen beams when one of them struck at the plaster and discovered that the wall beneath wasn't made of wood or brick at all. What flaked away wasn't dust, it was paper, hundreds of sheets of it, fused together by time and humidity. At first glance, it looked like the wallpaper of any decaying southern house, but when the historian's lantern caught it full in the light, faces began to emerge from the layers. Not drawn cleanly, but pressed soft impressions of eyes, cheeks, and open mouths that seemed to hover just below the surface. Some were faint as breath, others clear enough to suggest the faintest glimmer of expression, as if the graphite had absorbed emotion rather than recorded it. The room was small, windowless, and square, its ceiling bowed inward, dripping with old moisture that never quite dried. The smell was thick iron, mildew, and something faintly sweet, like paper scorched too close to a flame. Whoever had covered the walls had done so deliberately, gluing each drawing over the next until the plaster disappeared entirely. The oldest layers at the base had turned nearly black, the graphite bleeding into the paper like a slow infection. The newest were lighter, their faces more distinct, though all shared the same hollowness around the eyes. Dr. Main, wearing gloves slick with perspiration, tried to peel back one of the sheets. It resisted with a quiet tear, like skin separating from bone. Behind it, another portrait waited, a woman this time, her head tilted slightly downward, her expression almost tender. He thought at first it was unfinished, but then realized the mouth had been erased, scrubbed down to the pulp of the page. The more he looked, the more the walls seemed to breathe in rhythm with him. Condensation gathered along the lower seams, darkening the edges, as though something inside the layers exhaled. He noticed, too, the floor. The boards were warped, swollen upward in uneven ripples, as if something beneath had been pushing slowly from below. Each step released a damp sigh, not hollow, but full like air forced through waterlogged cloth. He knelt, tracing the grooves with his flashlight, and saw fine dark lines seeping up through the cracks, ink, or mold, he couldn't tell. The sound of dripping was constant but sourceless, falling from a ceiling that appeared dry. When he lifted his light again, the faces seemed closer. The graphite eyes caught the reflection like wet glass, and for a moment he swore he saw a shimmer pass across one cheek, a faint shift, the ghost of movement. He stepped back quickly, bumping into the opposite wall. Paper crinkled under his shoulder, and the sound it made was unmistakably human. A long, slow exhale, the sound of breath released after too many years of holding still. The ledger that bore Eli Thorne's name was found in a courthouse basement in Columbia, its spine split, its ink faded to the color of rust. Among the routine notations of rations and supplies, there was a short entry written in a slanted hand, Private E. Thorne, missing en route, last seen at Havelock property. Delivery incomplete, There were no follow-up reports, no recovery note, no burial record. Just a date, April 9, 1864, and a single line added weeks later in a different pen. Heard he was drawn before he went. No one who read the ledger in the years that followed understood what that phrase meant, but the handwriting carried a tremor, as if the writer had not wanted to write it at all. Eli Thorne was 23 when the war had begun. a farmhand from Union County turned quartermaster's aide, known for his easy laughter and a fondness for collecting sketches of the places he passed through. It was a cold March morning when he rode out with 2 mules and a wagon of cornmeal to the outlying homesteads, one of which belonged to the Havelocks. Witnesses said the fog was heavy that day, hanging low enough to brush the horse's flanks. He was expected back by nightfall. He never returned. The soldier who recorded his disappearance, Corporal Warren Pike, gave a statement months later after the armistice. It was a single page, water-damaged and nearly illegible. He wrote that Eli had stopped at a house half burned and half rebuilt, where a young woman with hands black as chimney soot had met him at the porch. She had not spoken, only pointed to the table inside, where sheets of paper were spread like offerings. Eli, amused, had agreed to sit for her. Pike's last line was the only part still clear. She drew me faster than I could speak, Eli had said when Pike asked what kept him so long. He had laughed when he said it, but Pike remembered the laugh sounding thin, like it had been pressed flat. Search parties found the wagon abandoned a mile from the house, the mules still tethered, the rations were untouched. Inside the parlor, the hearth was cold, but there were footprints in the soot, 2 sets entering, 1 leaving. On the wall above the piano, pinned with a sewing needle, was a single sheet of paper. The portrait was of a young man in uniform, his cap tilted slightly, his mouth half open as if caught mid-word. The likeness was exact down to the scar on his chin. When Pike returned weeks later to retrieve it, the drawing was gone. Only a faint square of cleaner wallpaper remained where it had hung. The house was empty, its doors unlatched, the wind moving through like someone still pacing between rooms. From that day on, the name Eli Thorne appeared nowhere else, neither in military records nor in family archives. But in the years that followed, soldiers stationed near Aiken County told stories around their fires about a man whose face could still be seen in certain sheets of paper when the light struck them at the right angle, the graphite glistening faintly like damp skin. There were many stories about why Clara Havelock never spoke, but the one her mother told most often came from the night she turned 5. The girl had woken from a fever dream and sat upright in bed, her skin slick with sweat, her small hands trembling as though gripped by something unseen. Her mother leaned close and whispered for her to breathe, to say anything at all. And Clara did, except the sound that came out wasn't her mother's name, nor a cry for help. It was a single word, spoken backward, the syllables warped and wet, as though dragged through water. No one in the house understood what it meant, but the noise filled the room with a chill that did not lift until dawn. From that morning forward, she never spoke again. At first, they thought the silence would pass, that her tongue had simply tangled itself from fear. But weeks became months, and still she refused to make a sound. Instead, she began to draw. Crude shapes at first, faces half-formed, eyes too large, mouths smudged into open ovals. Her mother burned those first pages in the hearth, frightened by the way the figures seemed to look out rather than up. Yet Clara did not protest. She only fetched more paper. As she grew older, her drawings grew precise, unnervingly so. Her mother would watch her from the doorway, the girl hunched over a small desk with a stub of graphite gripped between her fingers, her hand moving in short, deliberate strokes. The air around her seemed to thicken when she worked, as if time itself were holding its breath. When she finished, she would lift the paper, study it for a long moment, and then slide it beneath her pillow as though hiding a confession. Visitors to the house, neighbors, traders, soldiers, often found themselves the subjects of her quiet scrutiny. She would stare at them for minutes without blinking, memorizing every detail, then vanish into another room. Before they left, a sketch would appear near the door, waiting for them, folded once with their name written in faint, trembling letters. More than one man claimed the likeness captured more than their image. It captured their expression exactly as they had been moments before, not as they were when drawn. One soldier swore that when he picked up the paper, the eyes in the portrait were still wet, as if freshly painted. Clara's silence became part of the house's rhythm. Her mother spoke for her, answered questions, apologized for her oddities. But those who stayed long enough began to sense that her quiet wasn't emptiness, it was listening. The kind of listening that filled a room, that seemed to press against the listener until they felt their thoughts no longer belonged entirely to themselves. At night, she would draw by candlelight, her face half lit, her charcoal fingers blackened to the wrists. The sound of her pencil moving across the page carried through the halls like faint whispering, a language only she could speak. And sometimes, when her mother passed her door, she thought she heard Clara whispering, after all words soft and slow, repeating from behind the paper, as if the girl had finally found her voice, but only inside what she had drawn. The journal was discovered in the false bottom of a cedar chest, wrapped in a length of muslin that had yellowed to the color of smoke. The ink had bled in places, but enough of the writing remained to suggest it was not meant for anyone's eyes but his own. His name, scrawled on the inside cover, was Nathaniel Havelock, Clara's older brother by 7 years, the last son to carry the family name before the war consumed their father. The early pages were ordinary, filled with notes on repairs, crop yields, and the daily monotony of surviving a life reduced to scraps and silence. But as the dates approached the spring of 1864, the handwriting changed. The lines tightened, the words pressed hard enough to tear through the paper. The entries became less about the world outside, and more about the sister who never spoke. He wrote that Clara had taken to working through the night, that he would wake to the smell of iron and candle smoke seeping from beneath her door. Once, he said, he caught her grinding something with a mortar and pestle, her movements slow and methodical, her head bowed like someone praying. When he asked what she was doing, she looked up only long enough for him to see the streaks of red beneath her fingernails. On the work table lay a cracked bowl filled with gray dust. Powdered bone, he wrote. It gleams faintly when the candlelight touches it. The next entry, written in a shaking hand, mentioned a jar half filled with a thin, translucent fluid. He called it asterisk, the thin stuff from beneath the skin, asterisk. He didn't know how she drew it, only that it appeared beside her sketchbook each morning, its surface catching the light, like quicksilver. When she dipped her pencil into it, the marks on the page seemed darker, sharper, alive. He confessed that once, in secret, he touched the jar. It was warm. The entries that followed grew disjointed. Nathaniel described feeling watched, even when alone. He heard what he thought were whispers under the floorboards, the soft scrape of graphite moving where no hand worked it. One passage read, asterisk. She isn't drawing them anymore, she's pulling them through. Asterisk. Then, abruptly, the writing stopped mid-sentence. The next several pages had been torn out, their edges blackened, the scent of old smoke still clinging to the paper. A final note remained at the bottom of the last surviving page, a line written in haste and barely legible through the char. Asterisk. I burned what I could, but the drawings don't burn, they only darken. Asterisk. Nathaniel Havelock's disappearance was never recorded in any official document. The neighbors assumed he'd gone off to find work or join the soldiers he spoke so bitterly about. But when Mrs. Havelock finally opened her son's locked door, the room was untouched except for the faint outline of a boot heel in the dust and a single sketch on the wall, pinned where the headboard should have been. It was a portrait of a young man in a flannel shirt, mouth slightly open, eyes wide with recognition. The graphite shimmered faintly, as though the drawing had not yet dried. When Alden Voss arrived in South Carolina, the war had been over for 6 years, but its shadow still clung to everything: the broken fields, the scorched roads, the weary faces of those who had survived it. He was not a man of sentiment. His interests were purely aesthetic. He collected what he called artifacts of ruin, pieces that spoke of the South's decay in the way a ruin spoke of architecture. He had heard of the Havelock property from a traveling minister, who mentioned a mute girl who drew the dead, and a set of sketches rumored to have survived the fire that swallowed the house years before. Voss's curiosity was mercantile, not moral. He saw in the story an opportunity. Tragedy turned into texture, loss captured on paper. The Havelock estate was half collapsed when he found it. The roof had given way in several places, and vines had threaded through the windows like veins reclaiming the house. He entered through the parlor, his boots crunching through a thin crust of ash. The air smelled faintly of iron and mold. In the attic, beneath a fallen beam, he found a trunk lined with oilcloth. Inside were dozens of sketches bound with twine. Each was executed in graphite and pale wash, the shading so fine it seemed to shift under light. Most were portraits, men and women staring slightly off the page, as though their attention were fixed on something just beyond the viewer. He bought the collection from a local farmer who had been salvaging lumber from the ruins, paying far more than the man expected. The farmer refused to carry the sketches to his cart, muttering that the paper was too warm. Months later, Voss exhibited the drawings in a small Charleston gallery. He arranged them in a single room, 30 portraits hung in tight rows, their eyes level, their faces turned in unison. The first night, the reception was lively. Patrons admired the realism, the delicacy of line, the lifelike sheen of the graphite. But by the second evening, unease had begun to circulate. A woman claimed she felt a draft when standing between two of the frames, as though the air itself sighed. A boy reported that one of the faces blinked. Voss dismissed it as superstition, yet the next morning, the gallery's caretaker refused to enter the exhibit alone. He said the room was breathing. Visitors began to notice something stranger still. When they leaned close to study the drawings, a faint whispering could be heard, not loud but constant, a sound like pencil on paper, or someone exhaling words too softly to form. The noise stopped whenever more than one person stood before the same portrait. When the crowd dispersed, it resumed. By the third week, attendance had dwindled. Voss, ever the pragmatist, closed the show and crated the sketches for shipment north. That night, the gallery's watchman reported a final sound, a rustling like paper shifting underfoot, and when he entered, several of the frames hung empty, the pages inside replaced by clean sheets of pale, untouched paper. He never told Voss what he saw on the floor. Faint smudges of graphite, shaped like fingerprints, leading toward the door. When the surviving Havelock sketches were finally transferred to the State Archive for conservation, the staff treated them with the same caution reserved for artifacts too fragile to be touched without ceremony. They arrived wrapped in layers of linen and wax paper, the edges sealed as though the crates were coffins. The curator, a quiet man named Dr. Lionel Groves, began cataloging them with gloved hands and a clinical detachment that lasted until the first sample was taken for fiber analysis. He had expected the usual linen, cotton rag, perhaps a trace of animal glue used in 19th century binding. What he found instead made him set the slide aside and leave the lab for air. Under the microscope, the texture was wrong. The fibers were not plant-based, nor uniform. They branched irregularly, some coiling like hair, others tapering to translucent points. When magnified further, the threads displayed tiny pores, the faint pattern of living tissue. The sample was repeated, retested, and still the results remained the same. Traces of epidermal cells, keratin, calcium, and collagen, the substances that make up human skin and bone. The report, filed 3 days later, avoided the word human times altogether. It called the substance organic compound of undetermined biological origin. A second test, conducted by a visiting biochemist, confirmed the finding. Under ultraviolet light, the paper emitted a faint luminescence, a milky glow strongest along the outer margins, where Clara Havelock's pencil had pressed deepest. It was as though the drawings had absorbed light differently, storing some faint residue of what they once captured. The edges of certain sheets curled inward, not from age, but from contraction, as if the material remembered warmth. When Dr. Groves attempted to photograph one of the sketches under magnification, the camera failed to focus. The image blurred each time he adjusted the lens, the lines shifting subtly, like ripples under glass. He described the sensation of being watched through the eyepiece, an impression so strong that he refused to continue the documentation alone. A lab assistant took over the procedure the next morning, only to report the same problem. The faces on the pages would not stay still long enough to capture. In an attempt to identify the binding agent, the team dissolved a minute fragment in sterile solution. The mixture turned a cloudy red. The pH reading indicated the presence of iron. Groves stared at the result in silence before writing the conclusion in his notes. Asterisk. The pigment appears to contain hemoglobin. Asterisk. By the time the samples were sealed for storage, several technicians had begun to complain of a lingering scent in the lab, a faint sweetness, like dried flowers mixed with rust. One reported that when she brushed away the shavings left from a trimmed edge, the residue clung to her gloves and would not come off. She described it as warm to the touch. The official report was never published in the museum's quarterly journal. The archivist cited ethical concerns regarding public interpretation. The remaining sketches were sealed in temperature, controlled cases, and moved to a restricted vault. Only one note was left in the file, written in Dr. Groves' hand, asterisk. The material appears self-preserving, it resists decay, perhaps it was never truly dead, asterisk. The portrait lay at the bottom of the crate, wrapped separately from the others. The paper was heavier, darker around the edges, and brittle as bark. When Dr. Main unfolded the linen covering, the smell that rose from it was unlike dust or age. It was faintly metallic, almost like breath against old iron. The drawing was immediately recognizable. Even after a century of damage, the figure at the center was unmistakably Clara Havelock. She sat at a small wooden easel, her posture perfectly upright, the fall of her hair rendered in soft strokes that shimmered when caught by light. Her hands were detailed with unnerving precision, each knuckle, each nail shadowed in the same graphite tone as the folds of her dress. But where her eyes should have been, the page fell into absence. The sockets were faintly smudged, not erased but left unfilled, as though she had stopped just before meeting her own gaze. The historian leaned closer. The paper bore faint indentations beyond the visible sketch pencil marks so light they could only be seen at a slant. They extended past the margins, curving downward and off the page, a continuation that should not exist. He traced the movement with his gloved hand, following the invisible lines until they disappeared under the frame's inner edge. It was as if Clara's drawing had not ended where the paper did, but had kept going, stretching into whatever space lay beyond. Beneath the magnifier, he noticed something stranger. The unfinished eyes were not blank after all. The graphite in the sockets had deepened, creating a shadow that seemed to sink inward into the paper's surface. When he adjusted the lamp, the darkness shifted just enough to give the impression of depth, as though the eyes were half open beneath a veil of light. He blinked, stepped back, and the illusion was gone. Yet the longer he stared, the more certain he became that the face in the drawing was subtly changing. The mouth, once faintly curved, had flattened. The hand on the easel no longer seemed to hold the pencil but to rest beside it, fingers slightly bent toward the page she had been drawing. Maine's field notes, recovered later from his bag, describe the moment his reflection first appeared beside hers in the glass covering the frame. He wrote that the image was distorted by the curve of the protective pane, yet his reflection didn't move when he did. It remained in place, his entry read, as if the image within the frame was observing me rather than mirroring. He recorded that faint pencil strokes, invisible before, began to emerge around the lower margin, thin gray lines curling upward, the start of another figure taking shape. He stopped writing after that line. When the preservation team returned to examine the portrait, the paper showed no sign of alteration. The graphite remained still, the lines unchanged. Only Dr. Maine's fingerprints, faintly visible on the glass, suggested he had ever been there. Yet, under certain light, When the angle was just right, the archivists swore they could see something at the very bottom of the page, a blurred outline, the beginning of another hand, holding a pencil, halfway raised toward the surface, its stroke unfinished, its tip pressed against the paper from the inside. The cellar beneath the Havelock property was not marked on any of the architectural plans drawn during reconstruction. It was found by chance when a floorboard in the kitchen collapsed under a worker's weight, revealing a narrow stone stairway choked with soil and roots. The air that rose from the gap smelled of copper and something older, like damp parchment sealed away too long. When the historians descended, their lamps cast a trembling light across the walls, uneven bricks, slick with condensation, and shelves lined with jars whose contents had long since liquefied into amber stains. At the far end, half buried in silt, stood the trunk. Its iron fittings were rusted through, but the lock remained intact, fused shut, as though melted by heat. It took 2 days to remove it safely, and another to pry it open. When the lid finally gave way, the hinges released a low groan, and the air inside escaped with a sigh like exhalation. Within, laid in careful rows, were sheets of glass about the size of a man's hand. Each pane framed a single square of paper, pressed flat beneath layers of yellowed resin. There were dozens of them, maybe more, arranged with the precision of archival work, not chaos. The first sheet examined bore the faint trace of a face half erased, half preserved, as though caught mid-disappearance. Beneath every fragment, etched directly into the glass with a fine blade, was the same inscription, * March 14th, 1864, *. Under light, the resin clouded, making it difficult to see the details. But as the archivists tilted the panes, the graphite lines deepened. Mouths reappeared. Eyes flickered in and out of clarity. The faces were not duplicates. Each one was distinct different. Men, women, children, all rendered in Clara Havelock's unmistakable hand. The identical date raised questions that no record could answer. There were no local deaths, no flood, no fire reported that day. Yet here was evidence of something deliberate, a ritual or completion perhaps, carried out in secret and sealed in glass as if to prevent whatever lingered on the paper from breathing. One technician, cataloging the collection late into the evening, noted a strange phenomenon. When the lights were turned low, the panes appeared faintly luminous, their trapped portraits paling until only the eyes remained visible, floating in the dim. He swore that if one stared long enough, a mist began to form between the glass and the paper, something like breath condensing from within. The following morning, they discovered his workspace undisturbed, his chair pushed neatly beneath the table. The pane he had last examined was missing, though its catalog number remained on the manifest. In its place, on the surface of the table, was a square of clean glass fogged by moisture. When a beam of light hit it, the mist drew inward, coalescing into the faint outline of a date written by a hand no one could see. March 14th, 1864. The event of March 14th, 1864 survives not through testimony, but through a handful of impersonal weather notes scribbled in the margins of a Confederate surveyor's logbook. He wrote of a pale wind and air turned white, a fog so dense it obscured the horizon and silenced even the birds. The phenomenon began, according to his account, just after dawn. Those living along the edges of Aiken County recalled seeing the mist crawl across the fields like a rising tide, thick and soundless, swallowing fences, treetops, and, finally, the roofline of the Havelock plantation. It did not smell like smoke or rain. It had no weight, only a strange stillness that pressed against the chest. Within an hour, the house disappeared completely, leaving behind only the faint outline of its chimneys, like teeth in the mouth of a cloud. By noon, the fog had stretched as far as the main road, halting travelers who said their horses refused to move forward. The air grew cold enough that their breath no longer steamed. It was as if the world had paused, waiting for something unspoken to conclude. From a distance, witnesses claimed to see faint lights within the whiteness, flashes that pulsed with a rhythm almost human, steady, deliberate, and slow. No one dared approach. Those who tried said they felt the air resist them, a soft, invisible pressure that made each step harder than the last, as though the mist itself were holding them back. When the fog finally lifted that evening, the plantation stood visible once more, but it was changed. The fields around it were bare, the ground slick and pale as if scoured clean. No sign of livestock remained, nor of smoke from the chimneys. The house itself appeared intact, yet hollow. Its doors hung open. Inside, every clock had stopped at the same minute. The table was set for 6, though no food sat upon it. The fire had gone cold but left no ash. Upstairs, the beds were neatly made, the covers drawn as though in preparation for guests who never arrived. The sheriff who inspected the property found no footprints in or out, no indication of struggle or flight. Only the faint residue of moisture on every surface, like dew that refused to dry. In Clara's room, her sketchbook lay open on the floorboards. The final drawing was not of a face, but of the house itself, rendered in minute detail. Yet something about it was wrong. The sky above the roof was entirely white, a blank expanse with no shading, no horizon, no line to separate it from the world below. The edges of the page were slightly warped, as if still damp. When the sheriff turned it over, the back of the paper bore faint impressions of fingerprints, pressed from the inside out. By nightfall, the mist had vanished completely, leaving the air dry and brittle. The surveyor's last note for that date reads only, asterisk, sky white as bone, silence absolute, the Havelock's gone, air still trembling, asterisk. He never wrote another entry. The drawing was housed in Gallery Room 3, sealed in a double-layered case that controlled for humidity and temperature. The archivist, a young woman named Miriam Halden, had been assigned to photograph each of the Havelock pieces for the museum's digital restoration project. It was tedious work measuring light exposure, aligning the tripod, adjusting glare, but she found the stillness of the task strangely comforting. Most of the portraits were unsettling in their quiet way, yet none had ever moved her beyond mild curiosity. That changed on the day she photographed the 11th sketch, the one titled Only Times Untitled Female, March 14, 1864. Asterisk. It was a small portrait, faint with age, showing a woman's face in three-quarter view. The graphite had smudged near the edges, softening her mouth into something uncertain. Miriam angled her lens to avoid reflection and noticed, just for an instant, a shimmer across the glass, a ripple, like heat rising from pavement. She stepped back, assuming it was the reflection of the overhead lights. But when she leaned forward again, the light steadied while the shimmer remained, forming a pale oval where her own reflection should have been. At first, she thought she was simply seeing double, her own outline distorted by the curve of the glass. Yet the figure in the reflection did not move as she did. When she shifted left, it stayed still. When she straightened, it leaned slightly forward. Its face, faint as vapor, hovered behind the glass, aligned almost perfectly with the sketched woman beneath. Miriam froze, breath fogging the surface. And then, within that haze, the reflection blinked. She stumbled back, knocking her camera stand to the floor. The crash echoed through the empty hall, but the portrait remained unchanged. The woman on paper stared out as she always had, her graphite eyes dull and motionless. Trying to steady herself, Miriam lifted the case lid's edge, something no protocol allowed, and ran a cloth across the glass. The faint residue of her breath vanished, but another mark took its place. The ghost of a handprint, smaller than her own, pressed from inside the glass outward. That night, the security feed recorded Miriam returning to the gallery after closing hours. She stood before the same portrait for nearly 30 minutes, motionless. At one point, she reached out as though tracing the outline of the woman's face. The footage cut abruptly to static, and when the feed resumed, she was gone. In the morning, Her badge was found on the floor beneath the exhibit. The case had been sealed, the alarms untouched. The portrait showed no signs of tampering, except for one faint alteration no one could explain. The woman's eyes, once dull graphite, appeared darker, fuller, filled in completely. And if one leaned close enough, the reflection on the glass revealed two faces now instead of one, both aligned so precisely that only the blink betrayed which of them still belonged to the living. The first to notice was a curator in 1928, cataloging the Havelock sketches for a traveling exhibit on Southern art. He wrote in his notes that several portraits appeared slightly altered since the museum's last inspection, though he could not say how. The change was not obvious, not something that could be measured by photograph or compared by tracing. It was more a feeling, a slant of the mouth, a softening at the corners of the eyes, the faint impression that the subjects had turned ever so slightly toward the viewer. He dismissed it as the product of lighting and fatigue, but he began locking the gallery door each night with an unease he could not name. Over the years, the reports multiplied. A technician adjusting the frames claimed one face had blinked as she cleaned the glass. A student intern said he saw a faint reflection move independently of his own. By the 1,940 seconds, museum staff had stopped working alone in the archive room where the portraits were kept. They joked about the Havelock shift, a term for the subtle rearrangements that greeted them each morning: the tilt of a head, the placement of a shadow, the almost imperceptible way the eyes seemed to follow whoever passed. When the paintings were photographed again in 1953, the negatives revealed something no one expected. The exposures captured faint lines not visible to the naked eye, ghostly outlines of shoulders, hands, and faces, layered faintly over the originals, as if multiple portraits were being drawn atop one another. A technician, trying to align the negatives, realized that these overlays showed the same faces at different stages of life. In some, the cheeks sagged, the eyes hollowed. They appeared older, decades older than the portraits that hung in their frames. No official explanation was ever published. The museum attributed the distortions to chemical decay, graphite oxidation, and light damage. Yet those who saw the sketches in person insisted the expressions had changed. What had once been calm or wistful had become strained, the mouths tight, the eyes wide with some unspoken urgency. One visitor described it best in a letter to the curator. Asterisk. They look like people remembering something terrible. Oh. By the 1,970 seconds, the Havelock pieces were quietly moved to storage, partly for preservation, partly because guards refused to patrol the wing where they hung. The last caretaker assigned to clean them left an entry in the maintenance log before he quit. The handwriting wavered, as though written by an unsteady hand. Asterisk. There are more of them now. Asterisk, it read. Asterisk. Not more portraits, but more faces inside the same ones. Layers pressing through the paper. Asterisk. Today, the drawings are sealed behind glass, thicker than any other in the collection. The cases hum faintly, maintaining a temperature cold enough to slow organic decay. Still, each year, when the archivists perform their inspection, they find small differences. A shift in the angle of a gaze, a faint crease where there was none before. One portrait now bears a shadow along its jaw that no graphite could have made. It is not drawn but cast by something moving just beneath the surface, waiting to finish what Clara began. The grave was discovered in early spring, when a group of surveyors clearing the outer edge of the Havelock property came across a small rise of earth at the base of a cypress tree. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, just another forgotten plot in a field full of them, but the marker caught their attention. It was no larger than a child's shoebox, carved from local limestone already eroded by time. The inscription was barely legible, the letters shallow and irregular, as if etched by an unsteady hand. It read only times, Clara H. Asterisk, no dates, no epitaph. The simplicity of it made the find feel less like a memorial and more like a placeholder, a token left for something that wasn't entirely gone. The excavation was careful. They expected bone, or perhaps remnants of clothing, some trace of the body that belonged to the name. Instead, the shovel struck something that gave with a faint crack, like ice splitting underfoot. The ground beneath the stone was hollow, lined not with wood, but with layers of something pale and dry. When brushed free of soil, the substance revealed itself to be paper, hundreds of sheets, stacked and pressed into the earth until they had hardened together. The edges were curled, brittle, and flaked away at the slightest touch. Each fragment that lifted free carried faint traces of graphite, outlines of faces that blurred to nothing before they could be photographed. At the bottom of the hollow lay a small cavity, barely deep enough to hold a child. Within it rested a single page, folded many times over. The paper was damp but intact, and on it, drawn in the same steady hand seen across the Havelock collection, was a self-portrait. The face was unmistakably Clara's, young, expressionless, her eyes darkened into pools that absorbed the light around them. Beneath the drawing, in the same graphite, was a single line of writing, barely visible, asterisk. Here I kept what the world could not. Asterisk. The soil surrounding the grave was strange. When handled, it broke apart easily, but the scent that rose from it was not of decay, it was faintly sweet, like burnt sugar and ash. The ground seemed to hold warmth even as the wind passed over it. Instruments later recorded trace amounts of calcium and carbon mixed with cellulose, a composition eerily consistent with the analysis of Clara's drawings. After the excavation, the headstone was returned to its place, the paper fragments sealed in archival glass. Within weeks, the team members began reporting small oddities, the sensation of static on their skin, the faint rustle of paper in empty rooms, and the impression of soft pressure beneath their feet, as if the earth beneath the property still shifted, breathing, expanding, whispering in its own fragile language. None of them went back after dusk. The grave remained untouched from then on, standing small and solitary at the edge of the field, the limestone darkening each evening with the moisture that seemed to rise not from the air, but from something restless below. The tape was discovered decades later, mislabeled and buried in a box of unrelated museum archives, an unmarked reel from 1973, its label smeared and half torn. The handwriting on the canister was unfamiliar, though one word could still be read. Asterisk Havelock. Asterisk when played, the recording began with the dull hum of background noise and the faint, rhythmic click of film equipment in another room. Then came a man's voice, hesitant but calm, identifying himself as Asterisk. James Corwin, Restoration Assistant, Audio Log Number 9. Asterisk. His tone was that of someone speaking into the dark, methodically but with a growing uncertainty beneath each sentence. He explains that he has been working with a set of Clara Havelock sketches transferred from Charleston for cleaning and rebinding. His words are precise, professional. The drawings appear stable, he says, though the paper resists handling. It's warm. He pauses, a faint scrape of movement in the background. I can't explain it. Even through the gloves there's this give, as if the page isn't entirely flat. For several minutes, he describes the process in measured detail, the use of camel hair brushes, the chemical mixture for cleaning. Then, his tone shifts. When I applied light pressure to the lower right corner, he continues, the surface yielded slightly. It wasn't tearing, it moved. The tape crackles as if brushed by a sleeve. The sketch of the woman's face seemed to alter. The shadow under her lip deepened. It looked as though she exhaled. He laughs, a short, nervous sound that cuts sharply into the hiss of static. It sounds insane on tape, he admits, but it was breathing. I felt the paper lift against my fingers. A chair scrapes across the floor, followed by silence. For nearly 40 seconds, there is only the faint hum of the machine and a slow, irregular rhythm, soft, like fabric brushing against wood. Then Corwin's voice returns, lower now, almost a whisper. There's a sound under it. If you listen close enough, you can hear it move. He leans toward the recorder, the microphone distorting slightly, like pencil on paper, but no one's drawing. The reel clicks again. Something metallic falls a tool, perhaps, and rolls out of frame. The tape wobbles, warps, then flattens. Corwin inhales sharply. It's still changing, he says. The eyes, Christ? They're open now. Static floods the track, drowning his words. Beneath the hiss, another sound surfaces faint, deliberate, rhythmic. A pencil scratching, steady and unbroken, tracing lines too slow to be accidental. It continues for nearly a minute before the tape cuts out completely. When archivists later examined the recording, they found no evidence of tampering. The reel was in perfect condition. But when played in isolation, at high volume, the last seconds revealed something new. A soft breath between strokes, and a single, barely audible word drawn out like an echo from behind the glass asterisk. Closer. Asterisk. The Havelock drawing was added quietly to the Charleston Museum's Civil War exhibit in the spring of 1992. The curators displayed it behind tempered glass, lit from above by a single recessed bulb that gave the portrait a soft, sepia glow. The piece was labeled modestly Times, untitled, 1864, graphite on organic medium times, and mounted between two far less remarkable works, a soldier's letter and a faded battlefield map. Visitors passed it without pause. It seemed unthreatening, almost peaceful, a woman's face rendered with delicate precision, her eyes downcast as if lost in thought. The first person to notice something strange was the night guard, Harold Meeks, a quiet man in his late 50s who had worked the museum's graveyard shift for nearly 20 years. In his report, he described how the gallery's temperature monitors had begun to fluctuate after hours. Every night around 2, he wrote, room 4 gets colder by 4 degrees, sometimes more. I can see my breath near that picture. Maintenance checked the system. Nothing was wrong. 2 nights later, Meeks noted something different. During his rounds, he stopped to admire the drawing's fine detail, the curve of the woman's jaw, the faint strands of hair, the softness of her mouth. But when he returned an hour later, he swore the angle of her head had shifted. Slightly raised, his report reads. Like she was beginning to look up. The next morning, he told a fellow guard, who laughed and said it was a trick of light. Meeks didn't argue, but from that night onward, he avoided the gallery until his final patrol. As the week went on, his entries grew stranger. He wrote that reflections appeared in the glass faces, faint and pale, hovering just behind the woman's image. At first there was only one, but each night there were more, layered faintly like old photographs double exposed. They weren't spectators. Their eyes were fixed outward, as if sharing the same slow awakening as the figure in the portrait. There were more people in that frame each night, Meeks wrote in his resignation statement. Not drawn, but there. When his supervisor reviewed the footage from the security cameras, most of it was static. The lens trained on room 4 flickered with light distortion at irregular intervals. In one frame, frozen mid-glitch, a series of silhouettes could be seen reflected in the glass. Their outlines were faint but distinct, dozens of faces pressed close together, overlapping, all turned toward the camera. The image vanished in the next second. The portrait was removed from display 3 days later. The museum's report cited environmental concerns, though no damage was found. It now hangs in storage, sealed within a double crate marked Times, do not exhibit without approval, asterisk. But the crate itself has been found open more than once, the lid unlatched, though no one claims responsibility. And when the staff conduct inventory, they speak of a faint sound that rises from the wood, a papery rustle, soft and persistent, as though something inside were shifting to make room for one more face. The plantation was smaller than he'd imagined. What remained of it was little more than a skeleton of stone and wood half swallowed by the swamp. The porch sagged under its own memory, the air thick with the scent of pine rot and stagnant water. He had studied the Havelock story for years, followed the fragments through ledgers, weather logs, and transcripts, but standing there, the weight of the place felt heavier than any archive could hold. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that came after a long conversation had ended and something unseen was still listening. Inside, dust lay over everything in a pale, unbroken film. The parlor floorboards were warped, the walls bare except for the ghost outlines where portraits once hung. The historian set his recorder on a cracked mantel and began to narrate, describing the dimensions of the room, the lingering smell of graphite and char. His flashlight beam caught on something faintly metallic near the hearth, a nail driven into a loose plank. When he knelt to pry it up, the wood gave with surprising ease, revealing a narrow void beneath. At first, he thought it was empty. But as the light passed over the hollow, a glint of gray appeared. He reached down and drew out a small notebook, its cover warped and slick with time. The leather crumbled at the edges, but the clasp still held. The moment he opened it, a thin film of dust rose, spiraling in the beam like smoke. The pages were nearly pristine, yellowed but untouched, as if they had been waiting for air. All were blank until he reached the center. There, faint as a shadow in fog, was a line of graphite. It curved, hesitant, incomplete. He blinked, thinking it a trick of the light, but when he leaned closer, the line deepened, the graphite darkening as though pressure were being applied from beneath the page. A second line appeared, intersecting the first, forming the edge of a shape something like a cheek, a jaw. He watched, breath held, as the pencil marks lengthened in slow, deliberate motion. The lines grew thicker, more confident, coalescing into the faint outline of a human face. He dropped the notebook and stumbled back, the flashlight skittering across the floor. The beam landed on the open pages. The face was incomplete, only the right side formed, but even in its half state it was recognizably his own. His throat went dry. The graphite shimmered faintly, still moving, tracing the beginnings of an eye. He snapped the notebook shut, his gloved hand trembling, and shoved it back beneath the boards where he'd found it. The air in the room had changed denser now, colder, alive with a faint static hum. When he gathered his things to leave, he realized the recorder had stopped minutes earlier. The digital screen was frozen, a black square. He tried to restart it, but the device remained dead. Later, when he returned to his car, he noticed the fine dust from the parlor still clinging to his fingers. It left a faint gray residue that shimmered like graphite. Even after washing, it remained under his nails, dark and soft, as though something from the page had followed him out. The footage was never meant to be found. It surfaced years later in a mislabeled hard drive salvaged from a production company that had long since gone bankrupt. The files were dated March 2008 and belonged to a short-lived documentary project titled Times: The Ghosts of the South. Forgotten Legacies. Asterisk. Most of the raw footage was unremarkable, sweeping drone shots of the Carolina marshlands, interviews with local historians, B-roll of rotting estates half consumed by trees. But, among the folders was a single clip with no timestamp and no accompanying notes. Its title, typed in lowercase, was simply Times Paper Room, Final Take, MUV, asterisk. The recording begins in silence, save for the hum of the camera. The light flickers briefly before stabilizing, revealing a narrow stairway leading into what appears to be a basement. A man's voice off-camera mutters something about original foundations, followed by the sound of boots scraping against stone. The camera pans down into the chamber, low ceilings, cracked plaster, and walls entirely covered in what looks like parchment. The operator adjusts focus, zooming in on the surface. The sheets overlap like scales, each one stained with damp age. One of the crew members, a woman named Diane, according to the production logs, steps into frame. She points to the wall and says, It's not paint, it's drawings. You can see faces. Her flashlight catches on the graphite sheen of countless eyes and mouths, faint but undeniable. The cameraman lingers on her observation, holding the shot steady. For several minutes, nothing happens. Dust floats in the beam, and the sound of dripping water echoes softly from somewhere unseen. Then, just as Diane turns to leave, a motion registers in the upper left corner of the frame. It's slight at first, a shimmer, no more than the shifting of light on damp paper. The camera refocuses. The shimmer resolves into the outline of a hand, pale and thin, pressed against the wall from the inside. Gasps are audible behind the lens. The fingers begin to move, dragging downward, leaving faint gray streaks in their wake. The cameraman whispers, "Are you getting that?" The hand retracts. In its place, a shadow begins to take form not on the paper but within it. Lines darken, connecting, tightening, until a figure emerges, hunched, holding something slender and pointed. A pencil. The shot wavers as someone stumbles backward. The sound turns chaotic breathing, footsteps, a crash as equipment hits the floor. Through it all, the camera remains on the wall. The figure inside it seems to lean forward, its features still forming, but one can clearly see the movement of the pencil. It traces a line downward, slow and deliberate, as if sketching something beyond the frame. Then the lens shakes violently, the light flares, and the image fractures into static. When the video resumes, the room is empty. Only the paper remains, still and silent. The flashlight, now lying on the floor, continues to shine toward the wall. There, faint but visible, a new drawing has appeared. 4 human silhouettes standing where the crew had been moments earlier, their faces half-shaped, unfinished, waiting for completion. The footage begins with the faint hum of wind through broken windows and the rasp of shoes on the warped floorboards of what remains of the Havelock parlor. The historian's voice, low and measured, describes the state of the ruins for the camera, a final documentation, he says, before the property is sealed for good. The air is still, heavy with the smell of mildew and cold ash. His flashlight cuts across the collapsed beams until it lands on something glinting faintly in the dust. A single pane of glass propped against the wall, its surface unblemished despite the decades. He moves closer, murmuring that it must have belonged to one of the old display cases, perhaps salvaged from the paper room. The cameraman follows, the frame tightening around the historian's reflection. He crouches, lifting the pane upright. Behind the glass, the light bends strangely, distorting his image just enough to make it feel unfamiliar. "It's the last piece," he says softly. "The final window into what she left behind." As he speaks, his reflection begins to shift, not with the tilt of the glass, but with independent movement. At first, it seems a trick of perspective, a faint delay between his motion and the image echoing it. But then the reflection's head turns when he does not, eyes meeting his own. The air seems to thicken. The cameraman whispers something about a smudge forming on the inside of the glass. The historian leans closer, breath fogging the surface. From within that fog, a single dark line appears, drawn by an invisible hand. The graphite moves slowly, tracing the curve of his jaw, the slope of his shoulders perfectly replicating his silhouette in real time. He stumbles back, whispering that the line is following him. It does. The outline continues, shaping the details of his face even as he moves. The pencil sound is faint but clear, a dry rasp against glass. The cameraman backs away, his breathing sharp in the microphone. "It's drawing him," he says. The historian stands frozen, watching as the graphite lines thicken, deepening to the shade of shadow. The reflection's chest rises and falls not with his own breath, but with something behind the pane. 2 clouds of condensation form now, one on the outer surface, one from the inside, meeting in the center like a shared inhale. The camera inches closer despite the trembling hands that hold it. The last clear frame shows the historian's reflection pressing its palm against the glass, fingers splayed wide, the outline now complete. His real hand lifts, almost unconsciously, to mirror it. For a second, they align perfectly, skin to graphite. Then his reflection moves first, its mouth opening into a faint smile as the graphite hand drags downward, smearing both image and breath into a gray blur. The footage ends there. No record exists of what happened after. Only the recovered glass sealed now in storage, faintly clouded, with a single imprint still visible on its inner surface. A handprint, pressed from the inside out,